Despite commitments to eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking by 2030 as part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the world is at risk of failing to meet this objective. The Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking has warned that millions of lives are at risk as it publishes its first landmark report urging the global community to take action. Former UK Prime Minister Baroness Theresa May, who chairs the Global Commission, has called the failure to eradicate this scourge a moral stain on humanity, affecting an estimated 50 million people worldwide. I'm having a chat with her to understand firstly the report's key objectives.
Well, the key drive behind the report that's been launched by the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking is the fact that despite all the best efforts that have gone in over the years, we still see 50 million people around the world, and that may be an underestimate, 50 million people in slavery. And so we really need to act, and we need to act now. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 calls for an end to forced labour, modern slavery and human trafficking by 2030. So we need to take action.
When we look at the scale of vulnerability to exploitation, millions across the world are certainly affected. Just how much stronghold will this report have on tackling the magnitude of its prevalence?
The report has recommendations for governments. It has recommendations for businesses in terms of looking into their supply chains to make sure there's no forced labour. It has recommendations for civil society organisations in crisis contexts. But I think one of the critical things it does is it emphasises the need to bring together consideration by governments of a number of issues that are affecting countries around the world. So modern slavery and human trafficking shouldn't be seen in isolation. It is vulnerability to modern slavery and trafficking is exacerbated by climate change, it's exacerbated by the mass displacement of people, it's exacerbated in terms of times of conflict. And so when governments look at these issues, they shouldn't look at them individually. They need to recognise the interconnected nature of all these issues.
Now, in the business world, we do know that modern slavery in supply chains is quite rife. Beyond mere sensitization, how does the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking seek to tackle this for the long term?
In terms of dealing with businesses and ensuring making sure there's no forced labour in their supply chains, the first level that we're dealing with is governments, which is saying that governments should have legislation, they should have laws that mandate companies, require them to look into their supply chains, into their own operations, and identify where there is forced labour and to take action against it and prevent it happening in the future. And the best means that the report has identified for doing that is to mandate human rights due diligence for companies. So there's that level of businesses actually being required to do something by government legislation. But the second level of this is actually identifying how businesses can do this. We've started that work, but this will be also some more work to be done in the second phase of the Commission's work, is to be able to identify, if you like, the toolkits that can be helpful to companies in helping them to see how they can undertake this due diligence across their supply chains.
Now, the 2023 Global Slavery Index currently ranks Nigeria 5th out of 51 African nations for the prevalence of modern slavery. How important is Nigeria in the success of this campaign? And more importantly, what metrics will aid measurability of its impact?
Well, obviously, as you say, Nigeria is number 5 in that prevalence list. But the other thing that Global Slavery Index tells us about Nigeria is it recognises the strong action that Nigeria has taken with its National Action Plan to try to combat these issues. So I think it is an important country, both in terms of the number of people who this will affect, but significantly in terms of the example it can give of the action that can be taken by governments, working with businesses, working with civil society in the country to ensure that modern slavery and human trafficking is being eradicated.
Now, funding is another important area of concern. How difficult is it going to be to sustain funds for humanitarian projects like this, especially in a world where the US is currently drawing in its horns?
Well, we're talking, first of all, about some issues around legislation. So that does obviously take some time. Our end goal is actually the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7, which is to end forced labour, modern slavery and human trafficking by 2030. Now, doesn't give us much time, but I think we need to keep that goal in sight. In terms of the report itself, there are some specifics. So, for example, we're calling on the United Nations to set up a 2-year strategy and delivery group under the Executive Office of the Secretary General to deal with the issue of humanitarian crises and ensuring that anti-trafficking is an element, is an aspect that is taken into account when organisations are dealing with crisis contexts.
From a business perspective, what measures can be taken to bring companies making billions from human trafficking to book?
Well, I think there's 2 areas I would talk about. The first is when you're looking at business supply chains, we're clear that the legislation that we think should be introduced should also have penalties attached to it for those companies that don't do what's necessary, that don't identify and look for, and if they identify forced labour in their supply chains, actually take action to eradicate that. And then the other thing I would say is, of course, we must never forget that significant numbers of perpetrators are actually organised criminal networks. And of course, that is about the judicial system, it's about law enforcement, it's about identifying those criminal networks, them being able to prosecute and deliver justice.
And when it comes to understanding one's rights and basically being able to avoid getting into situations where you're trafficked or you in a case of modern slavery, how much sensitization is out there? Currently, of course, you're doing this work, but how much time would it take to get there generally?
Well, one of the things we've done is, alongside the main report, we've published what we call the prevention framework. And this identifies the various risks of vulnerability to modern slavery and human trafficking. And this is an important tool. We want governments to use this to be able to identify what they need to do in order to reduce those vulnerabilities so that they are removing people from a situation where they are more likely to be exploited.
Well, Baroness May, many thanks for having this important conversation, and we look forward to seeing more from the Global Commission.